what we have covered so far has been to a degree somewhat, I'd say philosophical, but somewhat. We've been defining truth and all that. Tonight, we're going to get in some real meat stuff. And so I don't know how to make it any simpler, okay? But I'll try. That's one reason I like to use the PowerPoint with lots of pictures to help to make it simpler for you. Because this is a subject that a lot of people have never considered. And I taught it a couple of years at the Bible College, a class called the New Testament Evidences. And I think I mentioned last week one young man was really upset after the first few classes because he'd never, ever considered the subject we're dealing with tonight. He was a new Christian, just about blew him out of the water. So hang tight, okay? We will get it solved for you. But there's a lot of information. I'll try to make it as clear and plain as I can. So buckle up and let's go. Our whole theme, of course, is digging to lay foundations. And the ultimate question is the Bible true? And we've got to ask true before we ask anything else. And we have defined each night what truth is. So think about it. I'm going to ask, truth is anything, TV, private conversation, book, electronic communication, anything that what? Come on. Accurately represents the reality. Good. Talk back to me, folks. Good. Very good. Anything that accurately represents reality. If there is reality, there's truth. No such thing as my truth and your truth unless you can say there's my reality and your reality. And if we're in the same place at the same time, no. If we're in different places, we may have different reality at the time. But anyway, if there's reality, there's truth. This part of our study, what we're covering tonight, really has two sides. We're only going to cover one of them. The first is, how did the message get from God to men? The second one is, how did the message get from God and the original writers to us over anywhere from 3,500 to 2,000 years? Without any glitches on the way. Now, I'm going to tell you a little story. Lucky O'Leary is studying for his Doctor of Divinity degree at Aberdeen University. And he decides that he is going to, as his doctoral dissertation, that's the big book they have to write to get a doctoral degree, his theme is going to be extra-biblical evidence of inspiration. Now, extra-biblical in this case means outside of the Bible, not especially biblical. As a little boy, I thought extraordinary meant very ordinary. It doesn't. It means anything but. Well, this extra-biblical is like anything but. So Lucky decides that's going to be his theme for his dissertation, is extra-biblical information about inspiration. Well, Lucky is plumb flat out of luck because there ain't any. Any place you go to get information about the inspiration of Scripture is Scripture. I mean, you go to some other writer and we'll see what he says, where you got. Remember when we talked about one of the ways of knowing is testimony? He's testifying to you of what he found somewhere else, which whoever else found it, that's the only place it is. That's one of the interesting things about the Bible being an inspired book, which we'll get to much later in this series, is there's information in the Bible you ain't going to get anywhere else. It's just, that's all there is. Ain't no more. And so, the whole situation maybe originally looked more like this. But we have two questions. Question number one is, how did it get from God to those guys? But we have to know whether or not what we have God recorded for us to read got to us accurately. Or we don't have anything with this number one. We don't have a thing unless what comes to us is accurate, is truthful. So part one of this journey we looked at last week, slight review. Through the centuries, scribes made hand copies of copies of copies of copies, copies of copies, till about 1450 when Johannes Gutenberg invented movable type. Were there glitches along the way? That is the question. Enter the science of textual criticism. Now, by criticism here, I do not mean when we criticize somebody, when the guy tells his wife, that dress makes you look fat. No. Or she tells him, you snore or something awful. That's not the kind of criticism we're talking about. We're talking about critiquing something. Maybe like the food critic visits the fancy restaurant, and he may give compliments, and he may the opposite. Anyway, that's what we mean by criticism. Textual criticism. That was on your list last week, one of the words you need to know. Textual criticism is a science and sometimes art, you have to be experienced in it, of comparing different copies of ancient writings to see how they may differ in wording. You got this text and this text, and they're the same little chunk of scripture, and so you use your magnifying glass and back and forth to see where they may differ. Well, why is it needed? Well, as a scribe copied to make a new manuscript, if he made a mistake, here's his manuscript, here's the one he copied from. You copy probably from this one. Guess what? You're going to include his mistake. And we got 2,000 years at the shortest time. How many of those guys made mistakes on? Copying was not an easy job, but this is the way they produced books. Many things made it difficult. Copying partly by memory. Let's say you've got an order for 12 copies of Ephesians and 6 copies of Colossians. How many copies of Ephesians would you have to make before you would be copying partly by memory? You didn't have to look back every line. Yeah, you get to 8 or 9, you think, man, I got this one. And then you switch to Colossians. There's some phraseology in Colossians that's very similar to Ephesians, and you just might put in a phrase from Ephesians that you remember. Dad used to say that Paul wrote Ephesians before lunch and Colossians after lunch and didn't stop for lunch, because there's some similarities. And so that makes a little wording changes. Sometimes they got 10 guys in a room called a scriptorium, scribes, and somebody up front is reading, and you're writing down what he says, and you may mishear what he said, or he gets going a little too fast, and similar word endings. Now, the Greek language, and we're talking about Greek New Testament now, the Greek language has a lot of similar word endings. In English, we'd say, he went to town. In Greek, you might say, like Yoda, to town he went. If the emphasis is on where he went rather than who went, you might say, to town he went. But if you want to say, he went to town, meaning nobody else did, you might put the he first. And to tell how they're used in the sentence, they often have very similar last 2 or 3 letters. That creates some problems. Are you ever reading and skip a line? You get sleepy and skip a lot of lines? Don't feel bad if you go to sleep in the middle of this class. I went to sleep in the middle of one of my own sermons one time. I kid you not. I was a student in college preaching for the little church I started preaching after I went through that dump of about losing my faith I told you about the first night. And a friend of mine and I had been to Mexico for a week for a revival meeting. Dean was preaching and I was leading the singing. And we stayed late for him to talk to somebody he needed to talk to before we left late at night from Saltillo, Mexico, to drive about 180 miles to Eagle Pass, Texas, where his parents live, eat breakfast with his parents, drive 800 miles home to Joplin, and the next morning I got up and drove 200 miles to where I preached. The middle of my sermon, I realized I wasn't making any sense at all. And I looked at people, I said, that didn't make sense, did it? They just grinned. No. I said, I think I went to sleep in the middle of my own sermon. But copying, similar word then to skipping, there's a real fancy Greek name for that problem. It's homoi teleuton, which means the endings are the same. So, variations in spelling and just plain old exhaustion. It's amazing to me that there are not more variations. When you see the kind of evidence we have, you'll think, man, the Lord had his hand in that. And I agree. Most of them are not worth translating. Things like a little difference in word order. King Herod says one text, another says Herod the king. Spelling variations. Spelling was not real well standardized. And a word or phrase might be inserted, omitted, or out of place, like I mentioned earlier, like Ephesians and Colossians. Sometimes a verse will be in one copy but not in another. And the textual critic has to decide, was this originally there, or did somebody stick it in as an explanation? There are a couple of places I think there's explanation given. When Jesus went to the lame man at the pool of Bethesda, remember the story? The guy's lying there on the mat, and Jesus said, you want to get well? He said, I want everybody help me in. Anyway, somebody always beats me. Some of the manuscripts say an angel comes down and troubles the water, and the first person in is healed. Some of the older ones don't have it there. And so the assumption is that was probably somebody put that in as an explanation. And the theory is that there might have been a cave that filled with water from a spring, and when it got full, it gushed out and made the pool. You all ought to be familiar with that. This is only one of two places in the world you've got the ebb and flow spring. That kind of thing. That's what was happening there. And so there is an explanatory verse in there that's not in the earlier ones, but somebody probably put it as an explanation. So that's sometimes the reason. There are only two places, to give you a little bit of confidence early on, only two places in Scripture that the variation is longer than a single verse. There are several places it's one verse, but the only two that are longer are the story of the woman caught in adultery, which is in the end of John 7 through the first 11 verses of chapter 8, and the end of the Gospel of Mark. And there's several different endings to the Gospel of Mark in early manuscripts that make me think that the very earliest copy of Mark, the last page got torn off, and guys had to copy from there on, and people kind of amplified it because the shorter ending really ends kind of funny. Okay? Well, enter another science to help the textual critic, and that's paleography. This studies ancient writing styles. Paleography is actually the study of handwriting. Decipher, transcript, date old manuscripts, focusing mostly on style and letter forms to understand which period the texts come from. How many of you took penmanship in grade school, or not grade school or middle school, junior high school? When I was in North Junior High School, 7th grade and I think at least 8th grade, had to take art and penmanship from Miss Dam. You can imagine what fun the kids had from her name. But anyway, I won't go there. We had penmanship 2 days a week, art 3 days a week, and we practiced writing with ink pens. 2 hours every week, all 5 days of the week in penmanship class. I think the way we were taught was called the Palmer method. Any of you remember that one? When you write your P, do you come up, go down, and do you close it before you go on, or leave it open? How many leave it open? You're too young to leave it open. You close it. Did you learn to leave it open? No. Okay. When my dad signed his name, his first name was Seth, S-E-T-H. When he signed his name, he came up on his T, he came up and made a little cross here before he wanted an H. When I signed it, I finished and go back and cross the T. That was a difference in the time and the way we were taught. So handwriting changes. You'll see as we show you some examples through tonight that you'll see some real differences in some of these. This is chopped right out of a website. They analyzed how letters were shaped and written. Angular in the 7th century, looped in the 14th century. Abbreviations, you know, a paleographer will have a lot of fun 100 years from now for the abbreviations we use texting. Some of you that use a lot of texting abbreviations will do real well reading Old Hebrew. The Old Hebrew was written without the vowels. THNKSTHDR is shut the door. No vowels. Now later, when people weren't speaking it, they started to add little marks below the letters called vowel points to tell you what vowels to use. I think I've got time to throw this in here. This won't cost you any extra. The Jews never did say the tetragram. That's the 4-letter name of God. The 10 Commandments say don't take God's name in vain, so they didn't say it. They always substituted the word for Lord, Adonai. And so toward the end of the time when the Jews weren't speaking Hebrew much, they would read the Hebrew in the synagogue and come to the YHWH, Adonai, and had little vowel points below. And our modern word Jehovah is the consonants for Yahweh, which is probably the way it was pronounced, and the vowels for Adonai, Yah-O-Ah, Jehovah. It's a smush word from Yahweh and Adonai. And so there's that kind of thing in the things that paleographers study. They also try to pinpoint when and where a manuscript was created, meaning copied from something else or originally written. And they date from papyrus, which we showed you last week how it's made, and parchment and paper. Generally, paleography focuses on Greek and Latin scripts, and it's almost exclusively dealing with ancient philosophers' writings and the Bible. Remember, what did we say the autograph was? Who knows what autograph is? Not Elvis Presley's name in your autograph book. What's an autograph in the context of what we're doing?
A signature?
No, it's not a signature. What is an autograph?
Original copy.
The original. When John wrote his gospel, or dictated, say it was on the Isle of Patmos, he probably wrote it. When John wrote his gospel, that one was the autograph. Everything after that was a copy. Okay? That's what the autograph is. Now, the further from the autograph in dates, the copy you find, the greater the chance of change. We'll bring that up in 2 or 3 different ways as we go along because that's important. The textual critic wants to find the oldest copy possible, oldest manuscripts. That's MSS's abbreviation for manuscript, plural. The paleographer dates the manuscripts he finds and evaluates them for quality. Now, some are a lot better quality. A paleographer will look and says, this guy was careless. This guy's really neat. And you usually value the neat writing because you think the careless one might have been faster or just careless. Maybe it's just his handwriting's sloppier, but since we can't go back and ask, we don't know. So the paleographer takes that into consideration also. Well, how many manuscripts do we have? This is a flat-out copy from a Bible Archaeology Report website. You'll see this 3 or 4 times tonight because it's that important. To date, as of this writing in 2019, and this has changed a bunch when I first did this PowerPoint thing about 12 years ago, and a whole lot since I did it as a video in the early 80s. To date, we have over 5,800 Greek manuscripts of the New Testament with an astounding 2.6 million pages of biblical text. While some of these manuscripts are small and fragmentary, the average size of a New Testament manuscript is 450 pages. Add to this the ancient manuscripts in Latin, Coptic, Syriac, Armenian, etc., which number in the tens of thousands. And those are the languages into which the Bible was first translated. So if an explanation shows up like that verse that's inside there about the stirring of the water, shows up in a translation that we know was made in about 300, we think, oh, that must have been in the original before 300. That one wasn't, but that's just for example. That's why the translations are important. We'll get into that a little more next week. We're going to look at just a few tonight. Now, we aren't going to begin to look at the 5,800. But let's look at some of the evidence. Over the last 400 years or so, about 450 now, because a little more, it's been more than 50 years since I started this. Scholars, archaeologists, adventurers, sometimes ordinary people, have found ancient manuscript copies of various old texts, including biblical writings. Souvenir hunters, some of them. And a lot of these things, when they come to light, the paleographers say, is this real? If you subscribe to Biblioarchaeology Review, you'll see every once in a while an article about something that may be a fake, and someone trying to sell it for big money. There was a sarcophagus several years ago that supposedly had the bones of Jesus' earthly brother James originally in it. They finally determined, nah, somebody invented and aged that one. And so that is a problem. But a lot of people have looked. They've been found in archaeological digs, monasteries, caves, even the garbage dumps of ancient cities, especially in Egypt where it's so dry, and you get very far away from the Nile River Valley. Everything is sand dunes. It's just along the edge of the Sahara. And they just took their garbage out and threw it on top of a dune, and tomorrow it's covered up. 1,500 years later, the wind uncovers it. So, oh, look at what we found. Most of these manuscripts are now in various museums, but they are available to scholars and translators, often online. I'm going to show you a few online here if I get the time, yeah. Here in a little bit. If you are a scholar who has the credentials, you can have access to a website or websites that will show you photographic copies of almost all of them. And you can wear your eyes out trying to figure them out. One of the most complete ancient texts has a real neat story about it. There was a German scholar associated with the Russian Orthodox Church, but he was German. His name was Konstantin Tischendorf. Don't you like their names? In 1844, at St. Catherine's Monastery at the base of Mount Sinai, he found the oldest copy of the Bible known at the time. Now, he had heard rumors that it was there, and he went 2 or 3 times, and he finally talked to one of the monks, and the monk said, well, I have an old Bible. And Tischendorf went and looked at it. He spent the night copying all night long by lamplight to get as much as he could. And then he was found the next day. Some of it was in the wastebasket waiting to be burned in their stove. And he convinced them, don't destroy it. And he went back. It was a Roman Orthodox monastery. Russian Orthodox monastery. The Eastern Orthodox Church had split from the Roman Catholic 10th or 11th century, some in there somewhere. It was a Russian Orthodox monastery. So he went back to the Tsar of Russia and finally took word from the Tsar to convince the monastery to donate it to the Tsar. The Russians sold it, I think it was to help finance one of their multiple wars. They sold it to the British Museum, and most of it's in the British Museum now. But a few pages are elsewhere. There's St. Catherine's Monastery. It's still there. And like I said, it took a while for him to get it. He called it the Sinaitic manuscript, or Sinaiticus, because of where it was found. There's a little piece of it. Paleographers date that about 350. There are marginal notes in it that refer to some other church leaders, church fathers they're called, that limit the time frame in which it could have been copied. It originally seemed to have contained all of both the Old and New Testaments in Greek. Now, one of the things I told you, word you needed to learn was Septuagint. That's the translation of the Old Testament from Hebrew and Aramaic to Greek, made a couple hundred years before Christ. This has that. The Old Testament is in Greek. LXX is an abbreviation for Septuagint. A little bit of the New Testament is missing, but about half of the Old Testament probably went into fire. I said before, the earlier the manuscript date, the closer the author to the autograph, the less chance for errors to be made through centuries of copying. Another one is the Vatican manuscript in the Vatican Museum in Rome. I have not been able to find anything really that tells where it came from or how it got there. But the Roman Catholic Church, more or less as it evolved into what they have now, began in the 300s, about 390, I think, the first guy to be called Pope. When Constantine moved the center of the empire from Rome to Istanbul and renamed it Constantinople, that kind of left a power vacuum in Rome, and the bishop or leader of the Roman Church in Rome began to be elevated to what's called Pope. And I can't find any information about how that or where that manuscript came from. It's also uncial. What's that? It's all capital letters. Paleologists date it just a little earlier than Sinaiticus, but it's a lot more complete. Current scholarship considers this one, Codex is just a book with leaves instead of a scroll, to be one of the best texts of the New Testament. Sinaiticus is its only competitor. It's a book. Pages of 3 columns. And there's Greek. I cannot read that. I couldn't read it. Even if it was divided into words, I'm too out of practice. But that is part of Matthew 11. And it's written in the typical uncial style, all capitals, no space between words. Now, the Alexandrian manuscript, so-called, it's in a British museum in London. Its history is kind of legendary. There was a church leader somewhere in the Egyptian area who claims it was copied by a woman, and he gave it to a king of England in 1628, if I remember the date correct, way back yonder. It includes most of Matthew, except most of Matthew and a little bit at the end. It contains all of the Septuagint and most of the New Testament. I reread that. There's British Museum. There's a copy. See how consistent their printing was? It's dated about the 400s. And here's an odd one. Ephraemi is a rescriptus. The original writing had faded. It was rubbed out, and somebody used the old parchment, little old leather, to copy the works of someone named Ephraim. But that copy was made in the 12th century. Tischendorf, that Tischendorf, deciphered the underneath text, and modern technology makes it even clearer to read. And it is copied, paleographers date it, in the 5th century. It's quite fragmented, but it contains material from every New Testament book except 2 Thessalonians and 2 John. Only 6 books of the Greek Old Testament are included. And see how it's one written over the other. I don't know how Tischendorf ever figured that out at all. Now, it's in the Bibliotheca, is how you say that, Nationale in Paris, the Paris National Bible Museum. These 4 uncial manuscripts, the Sinaitic, the Vatican, the Alexandrian, and the Ephraim, are the big guns, so to speak, in the battle for textual integrity. They're the most complete. All are within 300 years or a little more of the autographs. So they carry most of the load. When the paleographer looks, he'll compare things to those to see if there's significant variations. That'll be his first comparison. But they're not the only or even the earliest evidence. There's that quote again. More than 5,800 manuscripts, 10,000 Latin manuscripts, 9,300 manuscripts in various other ancient language. The date ranges from about 125 P52. Papyrus manuscripts got a letter P and a number to identify them. The old Hebrew or Greek Old Testament manuscripts, the parchment manuscripts, got an alphabet number. And that numbering system had already begun when Tischendorf discovered Sinaiticus, and he gave it the first name of the Hebrew alphabet. So it bumped in front of manuscript A. It's Aleph, okay. But they're numbered that way. That's what that funny looking P52 is. And that we'll show you copies of that. Thousands upon thousands. Now I'm going to take a time out here if I can make this work. Oh, there we are. This is a Wikipedia article. I just typed in Bible manuscripts and it brought this up. And I had not seen this before. There's a list of a bunch of the Old Testament ones. But I'm going to show you some of the New Testament. I don't know if you can see this very well or not. Okay, here we go. The earliest extant manuscripts that contain anything from Matthew, see that list? You may not be able to read those numbers. They're all P numbers. Date between 150 and 300 AD. Luke, there are 4 major ones between 175 and 250. John, there's a bunch between 125 and 250. Acts, there's 1, 2, 3, 7, all early 3rd century. I want to show you 1 Corinthians. You'll get a click out of this one, I think. Oh, come on. Did my hotspot die? Well, I'm not going to be able to go there. I'm sorry. I can go to this one because it's already opened. These are some early papyrus manuscripts. We'll get to showing you P52 in just a minute. A reason I wanted to show you the one from 1 Corinthians, as Tennesseans, it shows the first words of 1 Corinthians in Greek, Paulus voluntaris. Now, nowadays, volunteer means somebody says, I'll go. This is kind of like somebody told me they volunteer you in the Marines. You're volunteered. It meant call. Paul begins 1 Corinthians, Paul called to be an apostle. And this one little scrap that I was going to show you, I was using my phone as a hotspot and it died. But anyway, that's why I want to show you pictures of some of those scraps. Well, where were we? There's where we were. We'll go on. I'm going to show you just a few of the best and earliest papyrus manuscripts. P 45, 46, and 47. Remember that they're numbered P for papyrus and these numbering indexes that somebody assigns to them are part of a larger collection called the Chester Beatty Papyri, a guy who spent a lot of money buying these from souvenir collectors and archaeologists and so on over his lifetime. P66 is part of a collection known as a Bodmer, and P75 is in the Vatican Library in Rome with Vaticanus, and P52 is likely the oldest portion. Let's look at these. These three taken together contain most of the Gospels and Acts, the letters of Paul, and the book of Revelation. Dated about 250. That's part of Luke, and this is from Matthew 25. P66 is a virtually complete copy of the Gospel of John, dated no later than 200. Remember that number, that's important. Some scholars date it as early as 125 to 150. That handwriting looks a little different from some of the others. P75 contains most of Luke and John, dated somewhere between 100 and 300, probably between 175 and 225. Contains the text of Luke from chapter 3 through 24 and the first 15 chapters of John. But the most important and most interesting is P52. It's a little scrap. It's about that big, shaped kind of like that. Looks like that. There's the back side. A little bit of John 18, 31, 33 on the front, and verses 37, 38 on the back. Now that's important for 2 or 3 reasons. If you write on a sheet of paper a quotation from the Bible tear it out, one of these little ones. Do this at home just for fun. Tear it out and do the same thing on the back and count the number of words you have on each line so you have a consistent number. And then tear all the edges off. Tear off part of what you wrote at the bottom and leave yourself with a little scrap. Reading the few words that are on this line, and then you turn it over. What if you left a line out on the back? That would change all the words that were on the back side. If you even wrote a word out, all the words on the back side would be different. When most of these scribes wrote a consistent number of letters per line in the page, then the paleographer knows what should show up on the back side, because he knows how many characters. You're counting 17 or 18 characters per line. It's consistent. You go to the back side, it'll show up. If you leave out 5 letters somewhere in the part that's gone, that is decayed away, it makes everything on the back shift. So this is valuable for that reason. It tells us something about the age, but it also tells us that probably everything in between hasn't changed. It fits. If you reconstruct all the missing lines, it fits. It was found in Egypt, is dated about 125. Now remember, John wrote his gospel, one of the very early church fathers says, between 85 to 95 in Ephesus. There's Ephesus, the little dark oval. This copy was found in Egypt and was probably copied in Egypt anywhere from 30 to 35 years later, maybe as late as 65 years later. Probably not. That means the Gospel of John somehow made it to Egypt with enough reverence by the church to think this needs to be copied for folks here. And what made it Egypt was probably a copy of a copy. But that is very significant. When the textual critic has completed his work, the translator has what's called a composite text to work with. The composite text is, he's putting them all together, and it's not several words like an amplified Bible, but it's what he thinks is the best. And then it will include what's called a critical apparatus. This on this side is critical apparatus. Well, I thought I brought my Greek New Testament with me tonight. Maybe I didn't. I've got one with that. I don't know how to use it. I learned once upon a time, but I don't remember. Of the type that says, according to John, and most of the changes in this first section of John 1 are in who has the title and who doesn't of the ancient manuscripts. You can see that just by looking. Even if you can't read that, you can see that. So if a translator is going to work, he'll work from something like that. So when the texts are compared, were there differences? Yeah. Spelling, word order, phrase or two, phrase inserted. Only a few variations as long as a verse, and only 2 longer. None of the variations have any bearing on doctrine. Nada, zilch. Don't worry about it. They just don't. And nearly all modern translations will footnote all the significant variations. I brought 3 with me tonight. And if you open your Bible, if you got your Bible with you, open it to tell you what, open it to John chapter 8. Because I know you'll find one there. Beginning, end of John 7, John chapter 8. Mine has, right at the beginning, or at the end of John 8, before verse 53, or the end of John 7, 4 says, the earliest and most reliable manuscripts and other ancient witnesses do not have John 7, 53 through 8, 11. And if you go across the page, mine says on verse 8 of chapter 7, some early manuscripts do not have yet. Is that significant? Maybe. Jesus said, I'm not going up to Jerusalem, not yet going up to Jerusalem. Well, he went. So anyway. Now let's make a little comparison. Oh, I got time to do this, I think. Other early writings. Julius Caesar, ruled in Rome 50 plus years before Jesus. Wrote his Gallic Wars. He was a general before he became emperor. Wrote about his wars in France, Gaul. If you took second year Latin in school, you learned to read that. Gallia omnia in partes tresta visa est. That's all I remember. That's the first line. We had to memorize it 100 years ago, I think. 10 manuscripts are extant, remain. The earliest manuscript copy was made about 850 AD. So the time lapse between the right time Caesar wrote Gallic Wars and the earliest manuscript is 900 years. Tacitus wrote histories. Nearly all we know about Nero and him hanging the Christians on the poles, dipped in oil and set them on fire to light his garden parties. All that stuff we basically know from Tacitus, history of the Romans. He wrote about 100 years after Jesus was born, so he's very contemporary with the writers of much of the gospel within a generation or two. 5 manuscripts are known of his writings, and the oldest ones are about the same as with Caesar. Then there's some older guys. Thucydides wrote a history, mostly of the Babylonian area, 400 years before Christ. Herodotus, the same. Plato, you ever hear him? Well, that's odd. He lived about 400 years before Christ. Only 7 copied manuscripts remain, and the earliest one is 900 years from when he lived. And yet, if you go buy a copy of the works of Plato in English, everybody will say that's what he wrote. Aristotle, I like Aristotle. He's the developer of the science of logic, and I've taught logic. He followed Plato by a little bit. 49 copies of his works remain in manuscript form. But the earliest one is 1100 AD, 1400 years. I used to have a copy of Aristotle's works. I sold them, and I sold a set of great books of the Western world when we moved down here from Indiana. The New Testament is written between 50 and 95. There are more than 5,000 manuscripts. The earliest is 125, and there's only 30-year time lapse. Now look at the difference. There it comes again, 5,800 complete, 10,000 Latin. Yeah. Let's look a little more closely at the time gap. John's Gospel, written between 85 and 95, manuscript P52, probably 30-year time gap, maybe as much as 45. John's Gospel, written same time frame, P66, dated 150 to 200 AD, gap of somewhere from 65 to 115 years. Most of the New Testament, the rest of the New Testament, and we've already looked at those manuscripts, copied in 250, about 150 to 200 years. Most of the Bible with the New Testament in it, Vaticanus and Sinaiticus, 250 to 305 years. There is absolutely nothing else in ancient literature that can even smell the exhaust from those guys. It doesn't come close. Well, what about the Old Testament? Before 1947, the oldest Hebrew manuscripts of the Old Testament were no older than the mid-1800s. That's because there was a group called the Masoretics, kind of I don't know if it was a monastery or what, but they copied the Old Testament in Hebrew, counted the letters on the page, marked the middle and so on, double-checked, and once they were sure the one they had was accurate, they burned the old one. So we didn't have any. In 1947, now this is during the Israeli War for Independence at the end of the Second World War. You want to read about a little-known war, read about that one. A Bedouin shepherd named Muhammad Adib was chasing some sheep and goats at the North west corner of the Dead Sea, he threw a rock through a hole into a cave and he heard something break. He went in and he found, this is the area, there's the caves, and he found what are now called the Dead Sea Scrolls. The best and most complete is the Isaiah scroll, dated about 100 to 200 years before Jesus. When I think about that scroll being there, not just a copy of, but that scroll being there, with Isaiah 53 in it, that describes Jesus' death and resurrection, at the same exact time, Jesus, about 20 miles away, is hanging on that cross, I almost can't keep from busting out, either cheering or crying. The Dead Sea Scrolls are a major help in determining the text of the Old Testament. Though the time gap is about 1,000 years between the Isaiah scroll and the Masoretic text, the differences between them are very largely insignificant. But they can compare them now. And again, in your Old Testament, any good study Bible will give you a footnote to tell you not just variations in the text, but variations in translation. Yeah.
The relevance of what you just went through, the fact that the Bible has manuscripts, well over 5,000,
Yeah.
that are intact with no doctrinal inaccuracies.
Yeah.
Verse is what a lot of people argue, saying, hey, the Bible has mistakes.
Yeah.
But when you look at those other extra biblical manuscripts that you were talking about, that all those of Plato and whatnot, all the scholars present day, they widely accept it, even though there's
Exactly.
they're like, that's a fact, that exists, this happened.
One of my professors in college used to insist, and he wrote a little paper on this, that unbelief is deliberate. In many cases it is.
Unbelief is deliberate?
Deliberate.
Oh, deliberate.
Deliberate. We don't believe because we don't want to believe.
That's right.
I told you the first night about my experience when I didn't want to believe. But I did believe when I was given evidence, because the crumbling of my faith left a great big hole in my whole worldview and my heart and everything. And if it was filled rapidly with good evidence and built me back. But if somebody's not believing because I have a brother, I've got two brothers who don't believe anything, and one son who doesn't. And they've been hardened, like Hebrews 2 and 3 say, by the deceitfulness of sin. My youngest son has been married twice. He's on his seventh woman. At his stepmother Sandra's memorial service 2 years ago, he stood up at the open mic time and he says, I think you all know I don't believe what the rest of the people here have said tonight. But he did say something nice about Sandra. Breaks my heart. He lives out in Seattle. Of all the places for a guy who doesn't believe to live, it just enforces it anyway. I'm going to run out of time here in a minute. I want to finish up. What would should we conclude? Knowledgeable scholars. Frederick Kenyon, British paleographer, Bible and classical scholar, 1889 to 1931, held various posts at the British Museum, president of the British Academy from 1917 to 1921. He says the number of manuscripts of the New Testament, or early translations of it in the oldest writers of the church, is so large, it is practically certain that the true reading of every doubtful passage is preserved in some one or other of those ancient authorities. And with a Bible with good footnotes, you can read them all. He also said, no fundamental doctrine of the Christian faith rests on a disputed reading. By disputed reading, he means a passage that there's any question about the wording at all. No doctrine. The Bible has been handed down without loss from generation to generation through the centuries. F.J.A. Hort, Englishman, college professor, textual critic. He was a member of the team that prepared the first revision of the King James Bible. King James was translated in 1611. It was first revised in 1851. No, 1881. It's a long time it was used. He was part of the group that prepared the text and worked with the training. With his co-worker, B.F. Westcott, he prepared one of the first critical texts. My first Greek New Testament that I bought when I was in college, needed it for Greek class, was the Westcott and Hort text, 1960. It was still in use. He says the amount of what can in any sense be called substantial variation is but a small fraction of the whole and can hardly form more than 1,000th part of the entire text. 1/1000th. One verse out of 1,000 might be in question. And figure that you've got 14 verses in John 8 and about 16 verses in Mark 16. That covers a whole bunch of it right there. And both Kenyon and Hort lived before much of the textual evidence known today became available. And the first time we said Shirley MacLaine made that accusation, there's so many errors in the Bible, it's been translated and copied so many times you can't know that it's accurate. Yes, sir.
I don't know if I'm jumping ahead, but do you know when they added the chapter and verse to the text?
Chapters were added about 1,000. Verses were added by a printer as a marketing gimmick in the 1500s in his Greek New Testament. I don't remember the name of the one who did it. Dad said he did it on a horseback ride from Paris to Lyon, and the horse did half the work. Some of the text divisions are really odd, so I agree with Dad's value. Anyway, how would you answer Shirley MacLaine's insistence? The Bible has changed and translated so many times over the last 2,000 years, it's impossible to have any confidence in its accuracy. What do you say to that? My little sound effects thing doesn't have the sound on it. How do I use that? Okay, now real quick, we're wrapping up about the last 5 minutes. Sometimes people ask, why do modern Bibles leave out some verses? Mostly they ask that because they're comparing newer translations to the King James Version. The King James was published in 1611, before the development of textual criticism and the discovery of most of the evidence that we looked at tonight. But the King James was used for 250 years before there were any new translations, so it became the standard to many people and has continued to be since then. There are churches in my county over there, Hawkins County, who insist on King James only. They'll call it the St. James Bible. It's not. They want to see authorized version. That's because King James, when it was published, had it put on the file, authorized to be read in all the churches. But it was translated from a text. The text was later manuscripts, which came to be known as the Textus Receptus, or received text. A printer named Desiderius Erasmus published the first printed Greek New Testament in 1516. It was based on the manuscript he had, which was incomplete. So he translated the missing portions back into Greek from the current Latin translation so he could publish an entire Greek New Testament. Well, his text became the major source for what became known as the Textus Receptus. And here's a quote lifted right off the internet. I remember it was Bible Archaeology Review or what, that says, the Textus Receptus name came from a 1633 Greek New Testament featuring a preface stating, now you have it all, the text received by, now you have the text, textum, therefore you have, now by all received. Thank you, Yoda. That text served as the basis for most of the Reformation translation, including Luther's German Bible, Tyndale's, and the English King James Version. Now, the Textus Receptus is the older Greek text, the basis of the King James V, KJV, excuse me, I get going so fast I can't even talk. And doesn't date much earlier than the 1500s. The critical text is a modern reconstruction using scientific textual criticism to try to get as close to the autographs as possible. Now, which do you think would be more accurate? The critical text. Folks, the King James is not the standard to be used to determine the text of Scripture. So we can conclude, and we're done. In the moral and philosophical shifting sands of our time, we can know, I hope you know it's without a doubt, that we have the Bible as it was originally written. And that's our foundation for this building we're going to build. The sheet I gave you, I said turn it over now. You can see it. We have a text we can trust. We're going to build on that foundation of textual integrity to the next 4 or 5 sessions. There's what we're going to build. Each part of that. The next one will be authenticity, which is who wrote this stuff, especially the New Testament Gospels. Do we know who wrote the things about Jesus? Were they eyewitnesses? And then the next one is, were they credible? Can we believe them? And then the pillars are things in Jesus' life that they tell us about, miraculous things. The capstone of it all is Jesus' claim to be the Son of God, and the top, the book rack, is inspiration. You can fill that sheet out as we go through the next 3 or 4 lessons. Don't worry about it tonight. But that's what we're going to build. After we have that structure complete, we'll look at characteristics of the Bible that help us in our understanding. I'm about 2 minutes past time, but let me tell you one little story about how ideas and teaching involve. My dad was teaching a class at the Fairview Christian Church in Carthage, Missouri. It was when I was in high school, I think. And he was trying to think of a way to help people to understand that this understanding the deity of Christ and the inspiration of Scripture has to rest on a historical foundation to start with. And so he, just on spur of the moment, drew that little structure on a chalkboard. And then he came home and he says, that's pretty good. Others told him it was. And so he made it on, how many of you remember a spirit duplicator? The little purple thing that used alcohol to reprint. Huh? Oh, mimeograph was inked through a stencil. Spirit duplicator was, you could draw a picture on it and run about 100 copies off of it. But alcohol would absorb, anyway, would make the purple on the... Dad did it on that till he ran out of all the things. And he asked me, because I was studying art and beginning to do some drafting at the time, to draw it up as a ink line drawing. And then after I regained my faith, I made a set of flip-over charts of the whole thing that's cloth about yay big. And our Defenders Club got together and mass-produced those as best we could. We learned how to silk screen printing 2 feet wide and 3.5 feet high. And then in 1981 through 84, I went to Good News Productions in Joplin, Missouri, and wrote a 13 half-hour lesson series we called Solid. Designed most of the graphics, was the on-camera narrator, and we produced it, and it was used all over the world for a while. It is online now, but the technology is so bad, the visuals are horrible. I'll bring, if you want to find it, I'll bring how to find it next week. I hope I'll remember to. Won't take any more time tonight. Are you a little more confident in your New Testament than you were when you came in tonight? I hope so. I hope so. Yeah. Brian.
I recently found a guy named Wes Huff, who is he's one of those people that studies the papyri and manuscripts and languages. I don't know what it's called, but he described a lot of what you described today on YouTube. And like when he goes to the P57s and stuff, he explains it like you do.
There's a
West House.
whole bunch more stuff. I've got put all this in this time frame that you have to live with because your kids are done. But folks, there is so much more,
Yeah.
so much more, and I just try to illustrate it pictorially for you. I'm so cotton picking visual. That's how I learn best, and I hope that has helped you. I really do.